Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are, because it is certainly good to be here. My name is Baltimore Fats, and this is Mud City. Is it? I almost nailed it. It's been a while, a little out of practice. Hello, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well today. So I'm just going to jump right in. This is Casimir Pulaski. And this last week, the Discovery Channel, not the Discovery Channel, rather the Smithsonian Channel, even worse, right? The Smithsonian Channel put out a special revealing that Casimir Pulaski was a woman, or perhaps intersex. And so when I first heard the story, which I got through a Facebook group that I belong to for Baltimore history, it immediately came to mind that Route 40 here in Baltimore is named Pulaski Highway. So I was immediately interested. I was like, oh, here we go. Revolutionary War figure that I haven't really encountered in my research yet at all, really. And so, also with the Baltimore connection with the highway, I got to check what this is about, and also, having the mindset that I have, I'm always looking for, agenda stuff. I don't get my news or information from mainstream sources at all. So the things that I see come from alternative sources, and, you see a lot of agenda-driven stuff, and the trans agenda and the LGBT LMNOP agenda is, it comes, it's what I'm exposed to. I see that stuff, right? And so I have thoughts on it, of course, and and to have it come tie in through Baltimore, which of course has a huge gay and lesbian and trans whatever, community. So I felt like, this could be a really interesting story, right? And so, but of course, there are red flags all over the place. It was reported, this is the Smithsonian Channel we're talking about here, and of course, if you're in the fake history game at all, then you don't trust Smithsonian at all, right? I mean, they are the hiders of true history. They destroy evidence, they hide things, they cover up, and they're a ruthless organization. In that regard. So you don't trust that information, right? And then of course it's being pushed by all the mainstream media sources. When you do a Google search for it, every news station and every major newspaper carried stories about it this last week, because this could be a big find. So I was like, well, I need to check out Pulaski some more, right? And so the first thing is that he's Polish, right? And the Polish flag here is the red and white. I don't know if that's still the flag of Poland today, but I'm not sleeping on the red and white, and that's going to come up big in Mud City in the future. I'm going to be looking into the that Eastern European area, the Czech Republic and areas like that. So his story is really amazing, right? Almost like on the surface here, he's like super, I hate the word because it's so stupid, but he's like a macho guy, man. He's the bastion of masculinity. He's a nobleman, right? Soldier and military commander. He fights against the Russians who are trying to occupy the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth. Right? They lose, right? The Russians win, I guess, and so he goes on the run, and he runs into Ben Franklin, and Ben Franklin sends him to North America, where he joins the revolutionary cause, right? And at one point, he saves Washington's life. I mean, his story is absolutely heroic, right? Up and down. And to close it all out, right, he's awarded honorary United States citizenship, one of only 8 people in history. And so I gotta check this list out. This list is unbelievable. So we started, the first person, 1963, they started this. The first one, Winston Churchill, the first honorary U.S. citizen in the history of the United States of America. Yep. All right, the second, this Raoul Wallenberg. And you look at his achievements, and you wonder why or how he may have won this citizenship in 1981 posthumously. He was done, as most of these people, as all of them were. I think it's interesting that they differentiated it for him, but not some of these other historical figures. The next two are amazing. The Penns, the Quakers. I told you, the Quakers. Oh my God. Right, so the Penns, Mother Teresa, she gets in, right? Marquis de Lafayette, he gets in. Oh, here we go. They awarded him posthumously. You think in 2002 his award would be posthumously when they started in 19? That's so crazy. Why do they put that stuff in there? Here's the first one, number 1963. Do you need to be told that the Penns got theirs posthumously? I can't even say that right now. All right, so then after Lafayette, they get our boy, or whatever, Pulaski here. They put him in 2009, right? And then to round it out, the number 8 and 14. So it's been, closing in on 5 years since the last time they awarded a citizenship. It was this Bernardo de Galvez, right? I don't know anything about this guy. But the thing that really astounds me about this list, more than anything, are these Revolutionary War figures who get it, all right? And the Penns, too. I'm going to start a campaign. Why not the Calverts? We got to get the Calverts some honorary U.S. citizenship. I'm going to do that. I'm going to start a petition. So you just look at these characters, right? So we have a representative of Spain getting honorary U.S. citizenship. We have a representative of Eastern Europe, right? Poland and Lithuania, right? And then we have a Frenchman, right? They're all getting U.S. citizenships well over 200 years after the fact. All close together like this. That's not a coincidence, especially with their story being tied to the American Revolution and the concept of freedom and liberation from English control. Yet now, I don't know, it just raises flags for me, and I can't understand why. But anyway, so I just wanted to just stress that only 8 people, right? So this guy's story is amazing, absolute hero. And so for, when you look at, however you may consider the LGBT movement to be, and again, I'm placing no judgments on anybody, and this is not a judgment thing, and I have, like I said, I think I said in another video, I have a gay brother. I've known gay people my whole life, I don't judge gay people, but I definitely am leery of this, this sort of mainstream agenda that's carrying it forth, especially when you get into the numbers and stuff, and certainly the way I remember life growing up, and so if there is like a deliberate conspiracy to weaken the male-female duality, the divine feminine and masculine together, because that's the unity, right? That's the yin and the yang that make the whole. If there really is an established effort, to break that apart, and it just maintains the same game that they play with the agendas, the race agenda, this feminist agenda. There's you name your social cause, and there's an agenda behind it, and behind that agenda there are controllers, agents provocateur at best, right? And so this would be like a huge win, right? And so for that movement. So I wanted to kind of look into it, right? Because what they're trying, to so what this would do, I think, essentially, if I'm looking at it from that perspective, if I'm trying to, force this mainstream acceptance of transgender, or multiple genders versus male female with, the odd hermaphrodite thrown in the mix, if I'm looking to further that cause, having somebody like Casimir here in history would be a huge boon. And look at this. He's a worm knight. He's a blue and white worm knight. Look at that. Yes. I love this game so much. So, right, and if you want to legitimize, especially if it's only recently, and that's the thing I'm going to talk about. When did the agenda kick into gear? What has been the social norms for homosexuality? And that's how I'm just going to broadly term it. How long? What has been the social norms for that? And how long? All right, and so that made me curious, because if this is an agenda, to my mind, it's something that's relatively recent. Because, like I said, when I was young in the 70s and 80s, there was plenty of exposure to gay people, right? And and men in drag and things like this. And I brought up a little slideshow here, and even had Flip Wilson. He got both angles. He got the black minority and the drag queen in there. Liberace, nobody batted an eye at Liberace. I had to bring up a picture of my favorite. Charles Nelson Riley was my favorite. I loved the Match Game when I was a kid. It was on reruns all the time. I loved it. Absolutely loved Charles Nelson Riley. You'll see. I couldn't. The pictures didn't come up. Oh, is that where I ended? I brought up a few others. I don't know. I haven't really been able to figure out this new search engine yet. Like Rip Taylor, everybody remember him? He used to run around throwing confetti. I mean, there was always exposure to gayness in popular culture. It was always there, and I never recall. I mean, of course, there's going to be ignorance and hatred anywhere, they breed that stuff too. I mean, they got to keep the conflict aspect happening, right? So, I was kind of curious as to when did gay culture start in the modern era? And so I kind of started with the drag queen, because that was the most socially acceptable. You saw it in television. And so I'm not going to read all this by any stretch of the imagination. I'm just going to highlight it here real quick and, give you the ups and downs. Just is that it started in the 1870s in England and America, and it came out of the more dramatic habit of, since there weren't female actors back then, the actors, the female roles in Shakespearean plays would be played by men, and the Greek choruses would all be men, and so drag entertainment and back halls and things like this developed in the 1870s, which I think is very interesting, given the timeline for the reestablishment, the reset, whatever you want to talk about it, right? I mean, and you look at the way our modern history begins, the post-revolutionary, not revolutionary, but post-industrial revolution, right? It's this era. It's the post-industrial revolution era that really starts our modern history, and everything before that is kind of classical. It has this Victorian kind of thing, and everything after the Industrial Revolution has a much different feel, all right? And so the drag queen goes back that far, and the drag king as well, which is, I guess, what our boy Casimir would have been. And so when I think about, this kind of being an agenda-driven thing, I wanted to, my first thought is the CIA, of course, and, I spent a bunch of years, in the truthing game, but when it was, it wasn't as easy as the internet, right? But then by the time the internet was prevalent, I was, aware of my my blindness, and then I, got married and started a family, and so I was kind of away, and now coming back in, I was like, well, the CIA, I mean, I know they were in charge of all these agendas, or their associated organizations, and of course, coincidentally enough, the FBI had their very own drag queen who was the de facto king of the FBI for decades, J. Edgar Hoover, Um, so I found this article. Oh, is it not at the top? Who controls the gay agenda, right? It took some digging, right? By this Ray Songtree. I'll try to remember to leave a link. His blog is lipstickandwarcrimes.org. And I'm not going to read all of this either, but he does go into the, what would you do? Like if that was your goal, if your goal was to lay out a major agenda to push mainstream acceptance, that meaning majority acceptance of a very small minority, because even by numbers today, I did a little looking, they say 2 in 100 men identify as homosexual, right? And so that's 2%, and I think the number was about the same with women. So you're talking about 2 to 4% of the population. Well, even go up to as high as 5%. So how much influence in popular entertainment and culture should 5% have? Is the question, I guess. Should it be a dominating interest? Because that seems to be what's happening, right? So if that's your goal, if it's your goal, whoever is setting this agenda, if it's your goal, what do you need to achieve? And it's the problem reaction solution, right? You portray gays as victims and not aggressive challengers, right? You get potential protectors. And so, I wanted to look at the timeline, and so, okay, so now, when did this happen? When did gays become victims, right? Because that would be stage 1, right? And that's what I was kind of trying to look at, right? And, I found this wiki, right? The timeline of LGBT history, right? And it's amazing. It goes all the way back. And this is what the point I was trying to make is, homosexuality was always there. It was something that was always in our culture and something that was always dealt with. It was just a matter of, in which way and in which societies we deal with. Because in America, we're so myopic. I don't even know if myopic is the right word, but, we're so, we're so wrapped up because we're America and the media is so strong here. It's hard for us to see outside because we're not shown the outside world that much. America is the great experiment, right? Isn't that what Francis Bacon wanted it to be, right? And so they have, and I read through some of this. It has its ups and downs, but of course, at the very beginning, there's a lot of homosexual and trans, the gods going back and forth between sexes. Dionysus was raised by women a lot. Some of the other, I think Zeus was as well. And there's a Greek god who I'm going to talk about coming up, Tiresias. He's going to factor in the next set of arches and the B&O building. That's coming next week. So there was symbolism everywhere. It was on art and walls, and it was a part of the mythology, and then, when your big 3 come along, your Judeo-Christian, Islamic trilogy, it kind of starts to, and then it becomes sort of, taboo, right? But it's always present, and, they actually start to, in the is it Victorian or just post-Elizabethan era? In the post-Elizabethan era, they start. You can look this stuff up. I don't want this to go on forever because I have interesting points to make. I think, or I wouldn't be making this video. Like in the late 1700s, mid-late 1700s, they start to get legislation. There starts to be books being written, pro-gay lifestyle books, things like that. And then bang, right after the Industrial Revolution in the 1870s, in beer halls and stuff, we have the drag thing developing right away. And so, and again, there was always, especially with the establishment of the religions the way it is, there was always going to be hate and bigotry and violence, but also you have to keep perspective and understand that at one point it was accepted as it could be, and it was a part of the culture, right? It was back in the day. So, but what degree, to what extent, is what's happening today, more organic than, organic is the wrong word, but I mean, if the past repeats itself, and you look back at the history of the mythology and you see all of that imagery in the art, and we see it now today on our TV shows and everything, so it's all cyclical, I mean, so, and that's the one thing about, like, and this is a really good article, actually. I enjoyed reading it, but the problem is he comes from a hardcore Christian aspect, and that's, part of it too, but the thing about religion and truthing, especially when you think that there are agendas everywhere, is how can anyone be so certain that their religion isn't just another agenda? So that's why I always take religion with a grain of salt in truthing, but there's valuable information in religion, and it wouldn't be a huge tool of human control for as long as it's been if it wasn't important. I mean, there's much to be learned through religion. But I always thought that was kind of interesting. So we get to the timeline, and so if you're trying to reassert it, because, clearly since the 1870s you've had this thing brewing, right? It's when you start to want to legislate it, when you want it to become law, right? And so how do you do that? You need to create social organizations around that, and all of that stuff starts in the mid-60s, and that's where your CIA, that's where you think, if you're into the truthing game, that's where your CIA stuff comes in, right? But there's another component, and I'm going to come back, before I come back to that, the main crux of this episode, I don't have it brought up here because I kind of brought these windows up quick because I'm really kind of in a rush this evening. And that's why the reason I did this is actually like take 3. I wasn't crazy about my other 2 takes, and I guess I needed a little more time to sit with this information. And I like the way this one is going so far. But I do have an appointment to keep, so that's going to keep this one moving along. So I didn't bring up these windows, but when the activism movement starts in the 60s and stuff, that's when you look and you see you need to. This is where it gets the like I said, when did the agenda start, right? So although I lost their picture, I had like the drag thing was socially and pop culturally acceptable up through the very early 80s, 82, 83. Bosom Buddies would have just ended, and Tootsie with Dustin Hoffman was huge movie, 1982, I think that was. It could have been 83. He won Oscars and everything, right? But then, shortly, and now the next, if you're, according to this article here, if you're trying to, your problem, reaction, solution, you need to vilify the gay. And so how can you do that if they're winning Oscars and they're part of the pop culture? Well, you create the disease, right? You get HIV in there. And, anybody who's in the truth game for any amount of time has looked up the military or government origins of HIV. So that comes into play right around the same time in the very early 80s, right? And starts to overshadow the golden era. I gotta keep wanting to call it error. I should call it errors. I mean, it's a Freudian slip for a reason, right? They start to eliminate that, and I'm sure in the UK and other areas of the world they had, Benny Hill. I remember Benny Hill. Was he? Did he go in drag a lot? And Monty Python was in drag all the time, and so the stuff was in popular culture. It just was. So the AIDS epidemic, for what that was, really starts to turn the tide. And so then that's where the sympathy thing starts to kick in. and then you get your equal rights thing kicking in, right? And so when it comes to like the equal rights and those movements, and I just want to, and this is where it gets to be like the agenda thing. Who is it that pays for that stuff? Who, where do these organizations get their money? Everybody knows the one GLAAD, right? It's the biggest one, I think. I don't know. I looked up, I had a couple pulled up for the other ones, but and I just went into too much detail. There's no need to, I mean, everybody knows the story, if you're looking into this at all. And that's why I want to get to this part that I think is a little interesting that you might not be familiar with. But I just want to show you that the partners are all major corporations. I love that the first one is Gatel One Vodka. You got to keep those. You got to keep that contingency drunk, or they might think for themselves. And that's another thing about the whole equality movement, which I think is interesting, and it's funny too that because some of the gay people that I know in my personal life are mortified by the way some of the agenda plays out. They don't like it at all, but a lot of this is all media stuff, right? Comcast, NBC, Time Warner, IBM, Disney, CBS, Showtime. I mean, it's all media stuff, right? But what you don't see in these sponsorships is you don't see the medical. Where are the doctors and the American Medical Association, and where are those, so that you see that at least in the sponsorship of a major one like GLAAD, it's all corporate sponsorship, and I don't see any of it coming from the medical or science sector, right? And so, and I think that's very interesting, right? And so I wanted to. One of my favorite books is Red Dragon, and its sequel, Silence of the Lambs, and I love the movie Silence of the Lambs. And Red Dragon, the Manhunter movie is amazing, but the rest, I don't know. But I seem to remember. I don't know. This is one of those things. It was like divine inspiration. I was looking this up and seeing, how come there's no medical stuff? And for some reason, in the back of my mind, it came to me that one of the ways they caught James Gumb, the killer in Silence of the Lambs, was they looked at his application. He was rejected for sex reassignment surgery from Johns Hopkins. And so I thought that was amazing, right? When I looked this up, that Hopkins was the first academic institution in the United States to perform sex reassignment surgeries, and that was in 1965. Now, I don't want to make too much of this achievement because it was happening in Europe earlier than this, and I think it's even 10 years earlier in like Sweden maybe. But at least in terms of America, it was here, and so I'm going to read a little bit of this one, right? So in the 1960s, the idea to attempt the procedures came primarily from psychologist John Money and surgeon Claude Mignon, who were already treating intersex children who, often due to chromosome variations, possess genitalia that is neither typically male nor typically female. Money and Mignon were searching for a way to assign a gender to these children and concluded that it would be easiest if they could do reconstructive surgery on the patients to make them appear female from the outside. At the same time, the children usually didn't undergo genetic testing, and the doctors wanted to see if they could be brought up female. Money raised the legitimate question, can gender identity be created essentially socially? Nurture trumping nature, said Chester Schmidt, who performed psychiatric exams on the surgery candidates in the 60s and 70s. This theory ended up backfiring on Money, most famously in the case of David Reimer, who was raised as a girl under the supervision of Money after a botched circumcision, and later committed suicide after years of depression. Now, this is an interesting. I didn't look this up, but reading this and knowing the way that media manipulates stories and angles, I want to say that it wasn't Money who was responsible for the botched circumcision, and that Money was this kid's caretaker afterwards, who had severe depression, and he just couldn't cure that depression. That's what I get from that one. I don't know. I could be way off base, but that's my intuition. So at the time, this research led Money to develop an interest in how gender identities were formed. He thought that performing surgery to match one's sex to one's gender identity could produce better results than just providing these patients with therapy. Money, and understanding that gender was, at least partially, socially constructed, was open to the fact that transgender women's minds had been molded to become female. And if the mind could be manipulated, then so could the rest of the body. Dana Baer, executive director of Gender Rights Maryland, who came to Hopkins to consider the surgery in the 70s. So why did I read that? Milton Edgerton, who was the head of the university's plastic surgery unit, took an interest in sex reassignment after he encountered patients requesting genital surgery. And he, in 2007, told Baltimore Style, "I was puzzled by the problem and yet touched by the sincerity of the request." So we have a joint effort at Johns Hopkins from the psychology department and the plastic surgery department and other surgical areas, I guess, to see if they could help these non-gender specific hermaphroditic children. And so they did a social experiment on them, right? As scientists are wont to do. At least that's right or wrong. It was a social science experiment here. And so they performed surgeries in the 60s and 70s. But then as we go on in this article, let's see. So here it says, this program, including the surgery, is investigational, said plastic surgeon John Hoops in 1966. The most important result of our efforts will be to determine precisely what constitutes a transsexual and what makes him remain that way. So they were doing the science on it, right? They were making their own Frankenstein people to study, and they did a double-blind test. And the numbers weren't great on it. See, I don't want to go into the person, right? So it had negative consequences because when it was done, it was clearly experimental. Our opponents were able to use the experimental nature of the surgery in the 60s and 70s against us. So she has it's her bias to confirm that the scientists were working against them. They had their confirmation bias was that sexuality is nurture versus nature, right? And so she wants to say that they used the studies because they shut it down. They shut it down in the late 70s. Hopkins stopped doing the surgeries because, let's see. Let's see. So by the mid-70s, fewer patients were being operated on, and many changes were made to the surgery and psychiatry departments, according to Schmidt, who was also a founder of the Sexual Behaviors Consultation Unit. In 1979, SBCU chair John Mayer conducted a study comparing 29 patients who had the surgery and 21 who didn't. This is the double-blind, and concluded that those who had the surgery were not more adjusted to society than those who did not have the surgery, saying that so their place in society remained the same, except the surgeries notwithstanding, right? They didn't feel differently about themselves or their relationship with the world around them. All right, these test patients, right? And Mayer told the New York Times in 1970, "My personal feeling is that surgery is not proper treatment for psychiatric disorder. And it's clear to me that these patients have severe psychological problems that don't go away following surgery." And so I think it's important also that this happens in 1979, right, just a couple of years before the AIDS and HIV epidemic. I don't think that's a coincidence. And I think this is all part of it, right? That, perhaps, there was unhappiness with the findings of this study. And they kicked the agenda into the next gear, which was unleashing the disease and creating sympathy that way for the cause. And so just I wanted to follow up with that they had an issue, right? So the heads of Johns Hopkins issued a letter to their colleagues addressing increasing scrutiny of the institution. One of its faculty members had become the face of anti-transgender advocacy, propping up junk science to justify rejecting transgender identities. And so I guess this guy, again, because hatred happens, and I don't know this guy's story, and I'm not going to look it up for this article. I'm just pointing out that Hopkins has now done an about-face, and they are performing these surgeries again. And when was this article written? This was in October of 2016, so I don't know when they started up again. And it is unfortunate that there is like hate and, and I don't know what this guy's story is or the evidence that he was trying to put out in his advocacy or whatever. But, I think in terms of building an agenda, there's no coincidence with the institution of or the findings of Hopkins' experimental study in the 60s and 70s on transgender surgery. And again, I'm not going into the other areas of the world because, like I said, it was happening in Sweden and other areas and other hospitals in the U.S. I think maybe the Mayo Clinic had done some as well in that same time frame. And again, this is all just me like. I never thought, I didn't know in which way, the transgender agenda would creep into Mud City. I certainly didn't think that it would be, like this. And it only happens because, somebody threw a rock in the pool, and I had to look over, and that rock was Casimir Pulaski, right? And there he is. And they are trying to insert him as a transgender in history. And I wanted to point out a little bit about this story before I wrap it up, because I do have to wrap it up. So his burial, so he died in battle. And he didn't die in battle. He was wounded in battle, right? And they took his body. Let's see. Come on. Here we go. So he was attempting to rally the troops, and he got shot. And so he was carried from the field of battle and taken aboard the South Carolina merchant brig privateer Wasp, the South Carolina merchant brig privateer Wasp, under the command of Captain Samuel Bulfinch, who I think may have been related, or even could be one of the railroad barons, right? Where he died 2 days later, having never regained consciousness, right? He becomes a national hero, right? And his aide-de-camp, his personal servant, says that Pulaski received a symbolic burial in Charleston on October 21st, sometime after he was buried at sea. But that other witnesses, including the captain, Samuel Bulfinch, of the Wasp, claimed that the wounded Pulaski was actually later removed from the ship and taken to the Greenwich plantation in the town of Thunderbolt, which I love. For the Greek, for the Zeus connotations there, right? And so they headed to stir, and Lafayette comes and does the grounds. He lays the cornerstone. Lafayette does, right? His fellow honorary U.S. citizen, all right? So they dug up his remains, and they spent 8 years, from 1996 to 2004, examining these bones, to inconclusive things. And I don't have the article pulled up for this one because, like I said, I got to move along. But the first anthropologist or forensic doctor to look at the bones is he's like, just shoot me. This isn't Pulaski. That was his quote. This isn't Pulaski was his quote. It was a woman. And so because they did find a woman's skeleton in Pulaski's grave, but they did 8 years of testing on it with DNA and could not come up with anything. And they did the DNA test against a living relative of Pulaski's, a grandniece of some sort, and it came up negative. And then it took 14 more years. And then the Smithsonian comes up with their study. And the study says they do now mitochondrial DNA. And of course, for me, the Smithsonian is so crooked. How could you trust this study? And who's to say that, they say that there were some injuries that Pulaski had that the skeleton they found matched. But who's to say in the 15 years somebody didn't actually drop the skull and put a crack there? Oh yeah, Pulaski had a concussion, right? He got hit in the head, at that one battle, against Russia, right? And he had other injuries too. Who's to say that these things could have been faked and that maybe somebody found an old hairbrush back, in the old family days? They found some other form of DNA that they could test this niece against, and then they have their convenient results because it's such a long time. It has to raise suspicion because it's very convenient. They could slip this guy in there, such a heroic, masculine, heroic figure, who fought on the battlefield his whole life, if he was, or she, or whatever, if he was what he, as they assert, if he was, intersex, or if he was a woman dressed as a man, he worked hard his whole life to keep that a secret. And now who are we 250 years later to bring that up? And especially in this equality movement that as finding, people within it are squabbling. They can't even be equal among themselves, let alone with the type of equality they want from the population at large, So anyway, so from now on, when I see this stuff happen, because it is happening, and again, I'm not judging anybody, and this is just observational stuff, confirming my my bias, to conspiracy and agenda-driven control of the population, right? So from now on, when I see them trying to reassign sex to historical figures, that's the Pulaski principle. All right. Please, everyone, take care of yourselves and each other. Everybody love everybody, okay? And until the next one, cheers, guys.